consumer doesn't like it, they can always go elsewhere. And yet it seems to me that one of the fundamental problems behind that basic premise is that consumers don't know what it is that they're buying. And sometimes they are being told that they are buying one thing when in fact they are provided with something else entirely. Now this comes up in a couple of ways. It comes up just in basic advertising, where in this country, unlike some other countries, ISPs will often advertise the maximum speeds that you can get out of the service as opposed to the minimum speeds. And so many consumers are told they can get up to a certain speed, and the up to often in rather fine print, and yet the reality is for many of those customers they don't get anything close to that. There are other countries that have said that we ought to take the opposite approach, that a telco ought to stand by, or an ISP ought to stand by, a minimum speed at which they can virtually guarantee a consumer is going to get, and that's the basis upon which you advertise. I think we could do that. And I think we could do more, I think we must do more, about disclosing the kind of network management practices that ISPs engage in. And of course, the paradigm example for this has been the shaping that's occurred from companies like Rogers and Bell. Bell most recently, of course, in the case before the CRTC, where they readily acknowledge, at least now as part of regulatory hearings, that they, during parts of the day, a sizable part of the day, but frankly, for certain applications, will shape down or throttle the speeds down to, I believe it's about 80% down from the maximum speeds, or the typical speeds that they could otherwise provide. Now that's the sort of thing that surely ought to be fully disclosed. And when Bell initially started moving in this direction, they had virtually nothing on their website that even disclosed any of these kinds of practices. The same is true for Rogers, which for years was engaged in various kinds of throttling and shaping practices, and you could never get a straight answer as to whether or not they were doing it or not. Now it seems to me that whether or not you agree with the practices or not, it ought to be at a minimum a requirement that the disclosures ought to be fair and frank and fully accessible to consumers so that they know precisely what they're buying and can make as informed a choice as possible. Now, of course, I recognize there are those who will argue that there is no real choice today in the Canadian market. You can choose throttler A or throttler B, but at a minimum, you ought to at least be aware of what exactly it is that you're buying. And at this point in time, that's simply not the case. Of someone else's. This came up directly in the new media hearings, where notwithstanding the CRTC's desire to avoid discussion of net neutrality hearings, there were repeated attempts to raise the issue before the Commission, and in fact Palmorex, which runs the weather network, talked about specific incidents that they've encountered where some of the services that they want to provide they believe are subject to undue preference, where the wireless carrier prefers their own content or other contracted content over their content, making it very difficult for that company to do business, to use advertising models, to do a range of different things. And it's clear that the CRTC listened, and that the CRTC was sensitive to those kinds of concerns, because that's one of the recommendations that comes out of last week's new media hearings. So notwithstanding the headlines about the CRTC taking a hands-off approach to the internet or new media, which I think generally was a good decision, on that particular issue, on the undue preference issue, they said we have to ensure that it applies to new media as well, and I think we have to ensure that, indeed, that basic principle applies as broadly as possible in the online environment, whether wired or wireless. And here's one where you begin to bring in the Privacy Commissioner of Canada as opposed to necessarily some of the traditional regulators. We know that part of the way in which ISPs engage in some of these practices is to examine the packets themselves. I mean, there's just no way to identify what you're dealing with unless you're examining the packets. They have argued or tried to argue that, at least for the moment, they only examine very basic header type information. They don't go into the content itself. But even at the CRTC new media hearings, acknowledged that the technology was there to allow them to go further if desired. The Privacy Commissioner of Canada has really started to focus on this issue of DPI, and I think we have to ensure both that that office in Canadian privacy law ensures that telcos aren't able to engage in the kind of examination of what people are doing online, I think in basic violation of our privacy. So what can we do? I think this doesn't solve the net neutrality issue or the big issue, some of the big issues that were noted at the very beginning, but I think it moves us some way towards addressing some of the concerns that are out there, and from my perspective, there are things that we can do today. Thanks very much.